You know, when we talk about PTSD, our minds immediately go to, well, the mind, psychology. But what if a huge part of the story isn't just in our thoughts, but in our actual physical biology? Today, we're going to dig into a different way of looking at trauma. We're looking past the psychology and into the physical inflammation that can happen inside the brain, and how understanding this could totally change how we treat PTSD.
This sentence right here, it's the whole idea in a nutshell. It really challenges the way we've been looking at this, suggesting that to truly heal the mind, we might actually need to start with the body.
So, to see why this is such a big deal, let's talk about someone real. This is Michael. He's a former Marine, did 2 tours in Afghanistan, and came back with a classic case of PTSD. And listen, he did everything he was supposed to do to get better.
And when I say everything, I really mean it. We're talking 4 different kinds of SSRIs, 2 full years of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, specific meds for nightmares, other meds for sleep, plus regular group therapy at the VA. This is the absolute gold standard of care.
But it just wasn't working. His hypervigilance was so bad he couldn't even sit in a restaurant with his back to a door. The nightmares were still happening almost every single night. He felt emotionally flat, totally numb. And these chronic headaches, they made it impossible for him to even think about going back to work. His doctor had basically run out of options from the standard playbook.
So, what gives? What was everyone missing? Well, this brings us to the main idea of our explainer. We need to start thinking about PTSD not just as a psychiatric issue, but as a neuroinflammatory one. Let's get into the biology.
Okay, so deep inside our brains, we all have these tiny immune cells called microglial cells. Think of them as the brain's security guards. But after a major trauma, these little guards can get stuck on high alert. They get locked into an inflammatory mode, constantly pumping out alarm chemicals even years after the actual danger is gone.
And this table here, this is where it all clicks. It shows you exactly how that invisible biology creates the very real symptoms people like Michael experience. You see those elevated inflammatory chemicals, the cytokines? That's directly linked to feeling hyper-aroused and anxious. Those microglial cells stuck in on mode? That messes with your ability to regulate emotions. It even reduces the brain's ability to change and rewire itself, which is why people get stuck in old trauma patterns. It literally creates a physical barrier that makes healing so much harder.
So this is the big question, right? If there's this clear physical inflammatory thing happening, why on earth isn't every psychiatrist talking about it? Why isn't this standard practice?
Well, it seems to boil down to 2 big reasons. First, for decades, psychiatric training has been all about neurotransmitters. Serotonin, dopamine. The brain's immune system just wasn't part of the curriculum. And second, the drugs that can actually help with this kind of inflammation, they're old, they're generic, and they're cheap. There's no big pharma company with $1 billion marketing budget pushing them.
And that brings us to a really interesting potential solution. It's a medication called low-dose naltrexone, or LDN for short. It's an inexpensive, generic drug that seems to act almost like a reset button for the brain's overactive immune system.
It has this really cool 2-pronged effect. So on one side, it directly blocks a key receptor on those hyperactive microglial cells, which basically tells them to stand down and quiets that inflammatory storm. At the same time, it briefly blocks our opioid receptors, which tricks the body into producing a huge surge of its own feel-good endorphins. So you're calming the bad stuff and boosting the good stuff all at once.
The way it's prescribed is very careful, very gradual. You start on a super low dose, give the body time to adjust, and then slowly move up to the target dose over about 3 weeks. This low and slow approach is really important, especially for trauma survivors whose systems can be extra sensitive to new medications.
All right, so what's the evidence for all this? Now, I want to be clear. There aren't any massive multi-million-dollar studies on this yet, for the reasons we just talked about. But the clinical reports from doctors and the smaller pilot studies that have been done are pretty darn compelling.
This timeline is super helpful for setting expectations. It's not an overnight fix. You can see that different symptoms tend to get better at different speeds. Sleep is often the very first thing to improve, sometimes within a month or 2, because those inflammatory chemicals that mess with sleep start to normalize. Things like emotional numbing can take a bit longer as those natural endorphin levels build up over time.
And some of the research highlights are really fascinating. Studies with combat veterans have shown really significant improvements. It also seems to be especially helpful for those dissociative symptoms, that awful feeling of being disconnected from your own body or from reality.
But maybe the most important finding? As people's PTSD symptoms got better, the actual levels of inflammatory markers in their blood went down. It's a direct physical link. And how much does this potential game changer cost? About $40 a month. That's it. And that number explains everything. It explains why it's so accessible for patients who need it, but also why you'll probably never see a commercial for it during the evening news. There's just no big profit to be made. So, let's pull all this together in our final section. How does a treatment like LDN actually fit into a bigger plan for healing? Because, and this is crucial, this isn't about replacing therapy. It's about finally making therapy work the way it's supposed to.
This quote is probably the most important takeaway of this entire explainer. The point of LDN isn't to be a magic bullet. The point is to put out the biological fire in the brain so that the incredibly important work of trauma therapy can finally take hold.
Think about it like this. Trying to do deep trauma therapy when your brain is inflamed is like trying to have a heart-to-heart conversation while a fire alarm is blaring right over your head. It's almost impossible. LDN's job is to quiet that alarm, to create a calm, safe, internal environment where the brain can finally do the work of processing and healing.
So let's go back to Michael. What happened to him? After just 12 weeks of adding LDN to his existing treatment plan, his nightmares went from almost every night to maybe once or twice a week. His hypervigilance calmed down enough that he was able to go to his daughter's school play and sit in the audience for the first time in 7 years. He actually started to feel joy again.
Michael's story and all this emerging science, it really leaves us with a huge question. For devastating conditions like PTSD, have we been so focused on psychology that we've missed a critical piece of the puzzle right in front of us, the body? Maybe treating inflammation isn't just some alternative idea, but an absolutely essential part of healing.